The United States has no universal health care, no guaranteed paid leave, and one of the weakest social safety nets in the developed world. So why does it keep electing leaders that promise to protect none of that? And more specifically, how did Donald Trump get elected twice? I've been living in France since Trump's first term, and I get asked the same question over and over by coworkers, friends, and strangers as soon as they find out I'm American. How did you guys vote for him? And honestly, that's a fair question, and it's one that Americans need to sit with too, because this didn't just happen overnight. We didn't just wake up one day and accidentally end up here. Before we go any further, I want to say something clearly, because this often gets erased outside of the US. Tens of millions of Americans did not want this. They voted against it, they protested it, and they warned about the consequences. The US, as it is currently, is no longer a country acting with one mind. It's a country that's deeply split, watching two very different futures collide. This video isn't about calling people stupid or uninformed, but it's also not pretending that this was inevitable or harmless. It's about explaining how the current American political behavior became possible inside the system which Americans live, even when the outcome is damaging, dangerous, and deeply unsettling to watch. So, what does self-interest actually mean to Americans? To understand American voting behavior, you first have to understand that Americans and Europeans often use the same words, but they have very different meanings. In much of Europe, self-interest usually means material security. Things like knowing you won't go bankrupt if you get sick, knowing that your job is protected if the economy dips, or knowing that there's a safety net if something goes wrong. Self-interest is tied to stability. If the systems are strong, then the individuals are protected. That logic makes sense inside of a social democratic framework. But in the US, self-interest is often experienced very differently. It's less about what the system provides and more about how much control you feel you have over your own life. Healthcare is a good example. In many European countries, universal healthcare feels like freedom. You don't have to think about insurance, you don't have to calculate the risk, you don't have to fear the bill. In the US, people hear the same proposal and focus on something else entirely. They think, who controls the system? Who decides if the care is approved? Will I be treated like a number? Will I have any say? So the question isn't, will this help me financially? It then becomes, will this make me dependent on something I don't trust? And that same pattern shows up with welfare. In much of Europe, welfare is seen as a temporary safety net, something you might need, something you may never use, but it's there if you need it. In the US, welfare is often experienced as judgment. It comes with paperwork, surveillance, eligibility tests, and rules about how you live. For many Americans, especially those who have spent their lives doing physically demanding work, that feels humiliating. They don't see welfare as help. They see it as being told that they failed. Unions follow the same logic. In most European countries, unions are widely accepted as protection. They negotiate collectively so that the individuals don't have to. In the US, unions are often framed as something you turn to when you can't stand on your own. People worry about losing individual leverage, about being forced to make group decisions, or about paying into an organization that they don't fully trust, even when those unions would objectively improve their wages or their safety. All of this leads to a pattern that confuses most Europeans. Many Americans would rather struggle on their own terms than succeed inside of a system that makes them feel managed, monitored, or diminished. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they enjoy struggling. It means that independence carries a moral weight. In the American mindset, dignity is often earned through endurance. So when policies threaten that perceived sense of earned self-worth, even if they offer material benefits, they can feel like a loss rather than a gain. Another important piece that a lot of people miss is this. Americans don't usually vote as the economic class that they currently belong to. They vote as the economic class that they believe that they're supposed to become. In the US, class identity is fluid, at least psychologically. Someone earning a modest income doesn't necessarily see themselves as working class. They often see themselves as temporarily behind where they should be, behind where they're headed. There's a famous line often attributed to John Steinbeck that captures this mindset well. He says, "Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires." Whether or not Steinbeck actually meant it this way, the mentality he describes is real. People don't evaluate policies based on who they are right now. They evaluate policies based on who they believe they'll be later. This is why debates about taxing the wealthy always land so differently in the US. When Europeans ask Americans why they oppose higher taxes on the rich, even when they're not rich themselves, this is a big part of the answer. Most Americans don't think, that won't affect me. They think, that will affect me when I finally make it. And this is where the idea of redistribution becomes emotionally charged. In much of Europe, Redistribution often means something concrete and collective. Higher earners contributing more through taxes so that shared systems like education, healthcare, pensions, and infrastructure stay strong and accessible to everyone. In the US, this same idea of redistribution is often heard in a way more personal way. It doesn't sound like money moving at the top to stabilize the system. It sounds like something being taken away from your future. People start to imagine their paycheck shrinking once they start earning more, overtime hours being taxed harder, small business income being capped, and success being penalized the moment it arrives. So to them, the idea of redistribution doesn't feel like balance. It feels like interference. Interference in the idea that if you work harder, sacrifice more, and push through, you'll eventually get ahead. And that's why acknowledging structural inequality is so destabilizing in the US. Because if people start to realize that their life outcomes are heavily shaped by factors outside of their control, where you were born, who your parents were, what resources you had, then effort alone stops being the explanation on why you haven't succeeded in life. And if effort no longer guarantees reward, then the entire moral story people use to justify their sacrifices starts to crack. There's also another layer here that's harder to talk about. Americans aren't just taught that success is possible. They're taught that America itself is exceptional. From a very young age, Americans hear that it's the greatest country in the world, with the most freedom, the most innovative, the place where anyone can succeed if they try hard enough. And that messaging is not at all subtle. It's in the media, it's in our schools, political speeches, national rituals. So along with that comes another idea. If a country is fundamentally great, then failure must be personal. If you're struggling, it's not because the system is broken. It's because you didn't work hard enough, didn't sacrifice enough, didn't make the right choices. And for a long time, that story helped people make sense of hardship. But as trust in major institutions erodes, that belief becomes harder to sustain. Wages stagnate, healthcare costs rise, college degrees stop guaranteeing stability. The rules that people were told to follow don't seem to work anymore. And yet this idea that America is the best doesn't disappear. It becomes defensive. People still believe that the country should be great, and when it isn't working for them, the gap feels personal. And that's where resentment enters. It's the feeling that you did everything you were told to do, you played by the rules, and still didn't get what you were promised. And resentment is a powerful feeling, because it makes people more open to leaders who say, "Nothing is wrong with you. The country was taken from you. I can restore what you were owed." Those empty promises don't require accountability. They just require people to have someone to blame. And once that emotional logic takes hold, policy details matter a lot less than the feeling of being vindicated. And that sense of entitlement does not stop at US borders. It also shows up in how Americans think about power abroad. When leaders threaten to take territory from allies or use force to protect national interests, many Americans don't hear danger. They hear strength. From Europe and the rest of the world, this is obviously very deeply alarming. But from inside the US, it reassures Americans who believe that the US is entitled to act first and justify later, and that any resistance from allies, institutions, or international law is just an obstacle and not a boundary. Distrust of the government in the United States did not start with Trump. It didn't start with Republicans, and it didn't start in the last decade. For many Americans, government has never felt like a quiet, reliable presence in the background of daily life. It has felt distant, complicated, and at times, punishing. Historically, government power in the US often showed up in people's lives through enforcement rather than support. For Indigenous communities, this meant land seizures, forced removals, and broken treaties. For Black Americans, it meant segregation enforced by law, discriminatory policing, and surveillance. For immigrants, it meant raids, detention, and the constant threat of deportation. For poor and working-class Americans, it often meant aggressive tax collections, fines, and penalties, not protection. Even when government programs existed, access to them was uneven and conditional. Help came with forms to fill out, rules to follow, eligibility checks, and the risk of being denied. So for many people, interacting with the state didn't feel like being cared for. It felt like being evaluated. Then there's the frontier mentality, which still shapes how a lot of Americans think today. The US didn't develop around dense cities and shared public institutions in the way a lot of European cities did. It developed through expansion, often into sparsely populated areas where government support was far away, sparse, or non-existent. If your barn burnt down, you rebuilt it yourself. If you got sick, your family handled it. If you lost work, you figured it out. That kind of self-reliance became a measure of moral worth. Handling things on your own wasn't just necessary, but it was admirable. And even after the frontier officially closed, that mindset stuck. It became part of how Americans defined strength, responsibility, and adulthood. Then, in the 20th century, the distrust of the government took on a new layer, During the Cold War, Americans were repeatedly told that large government systems were dangerous. Socialism wasn't presented as a different policy model. It was presented as something that erased individuality, crushed freedom, and concentrated power. And this message was reinforced everywhere, in school textbooks, in political speeches, Hollywood films. Big government became shorthand for loss of control. So by the time debates about healthcare, welfare, or regulation emerged, Americans already had a built-in suspicion of the idea. Not because they had studied all the policy details and weighed the pros and cons, but because they had been taught what government expansion was supposed to represent. And what's striking is that this distrust in the government is not applied evenly. Many conservative Americans distrust government when it comes to regulating businesses, expanding healthcare, or redistributing resources. But that skepticism seems to quickly disappear when that same government uses force in their policing, deportation, and military threats. Control feels unacceptable when it limits them, but it feels reassuring when it targets someone else. One of the most important things to understand about Trump's support is this. Many of his voters were not the poorest Americans. They were people whose relative status in life declined. And that sense of status loss shows up very clearly in this space when it comes to gender. For generations in the US, masculinity was tied to a very specific role, being the provider. A man was expected to work hard, earn money, and support a family. The role came with social respect, authority in the household, and a clear sense of purpose. You didn't need to be wealthy. You just needed to be dependable. And as long as that role existed, many men felt like they knew where they stood. But over the last few decades, that foundation has weakened. Jobs that once made that provider role possible, manufacturing, mining, industrial labor, declined or have become less stable. And even when men stayed employed, the work often paid less, carried less prestige, or offered less security. Meanwhile, women gained more independence, more education, more economic power. More women delayed marriage and having babies, and were now earning their own money, and were no longer dependent on a male breadwinner to survive. And that progress is real, necessary, and long overdue. But for some men, it disrupted this role that they were told was guaranteed. If your whole identity was built around being needed, and suddenly you're no longer essential in the same way, that can feel like a loss of identity, and not just a change in circumstances. Sociologists sometimes describe this reaction as aggrieved entitlement. The feeling that the role you were promised, respect, authority, and purpose, is being taken from you, even though you follow the rules. This is where Trump's messaging lands. When Trump talks about traditional values, about restoring respect, strength, and order, about men being men again, and getting the country back to how it was, he's speaking directly to that anxiety. He isn't offering job retraining programs or new economic models. He's offering something more emotional: reassurance. Reassurance that you're right to expect respect, that you're right to see this as a loss, that your role still matters, that all of this is so unfair. For many of his supporters, this isn't about policy or what he's actually going to do. It's about their egos. One of the biggest reasons that American voting behavior looks incomprehensible from outside the US is this: Americans are not consuming the same information. And I'm not just talking about political bias. I'm talking about entirely different information ecosystems. In the US, news is not centralized or broadly shared in the same way that it is in a lot of European countries. There's no single national broadcast that most people watch and trust. Instead, information is fragmented across cable networks with clear ideological leanings. Talk radio shows that dominate long commutes in suburban and rural areas, podcasts that blend identity, opinion, and entertainment all into one, and social media platforms where algorithms curate what you see. Over time, these systems don't just inform people about what's going on. They shape what feels real. Research from the Pew Research Center shows that Americans increasingly choose news sources that align with their political ideology, and that Republicans and Democrats now rely on largely separate media ecosystems with very little overlap in trusted sources. For example, a majority of Republicans say that they trust Fox News, and it remains by far their most commonly used news source. Republicans also tend to rely on a relatively small, concentrated group of news outlets, while expressing high levels of distrust towards major broadcast networks and mainstream news organizations. Democrats, by contrast, trust a wider range of sources. Major broadcast networks, public media, international outlets, wire services, and multiple cable networks are all trusted by large shares of Democratic voters, and Democrats are generally less likely to say that they actively distrust most news sources. But the result of this isn't just that people are hearing different opinions about the same facts. The problem is they're being exposed to different facts, emphasized differently from sources that they've been taught to trust or distrust on an identity level. And social media really accelerates this separation. Platforms like Facebook, TikTok, and X are designed to maximize engagement, not accuracy. Multiple studies have shown that emotionally charged content spreads faster than neutral or factual information, especially content that triggers anger or fear. The algorithm learns what keeps you scrolling. If you engage with stories about crime, you'll see more crime. If you engage with stories about cultural decline, you'll see more cultural decline. And if you engage with stories about outrage with elites or institutions, guess what? You'll be shown constant confirmation that those elites are corrupt. Over time, this creates feedback loops. So people aren't just forming opinions, they're living in completely different realities. And this is where a lot of Europeans often underestimate what's happening, because to them, it seems like Americans are just ignoring the facts, which isn't 100% false. A lot of Americans are ignoring the facts. But from the inside, many people feel extremely well informed, because in their reality, they are. They know the stories that everyone around them is talking about. They recognize the same villains. They speak in the same language. They see repeated confirmation from sources that they trust. Politics then stops becoming a set of policy preferences and starts becoming your social identity. Who you vote for signals who you are, who you trust, and who you belong with. That's why disagreeing with them feels personal. This shows up geographically and socially in very visible ways. A really good example of how political identity has become personal in the US is the phrase, "Don't California my Texas." On the surface, it sounds like a stupid joke about geography, but it's not really about California. California has become a symbol in American politics as a shorthand for liberal social values, environmental regulation, higher taxes, diverse cities, and progressive politics. So when someone says, "Don't California my Texas," they're not saying, "I don't like Californians." They're saying, "I don't want people who vote differently, think differently, or live differently, changing the place that I identify with." This shows how political identity in the US has become fused with location. In some parts of the US, where you come from is assumed to say something about your values, your morals, and who you voted for politically. And there are examples of this playing out in everyday life. People moving from states like California or New York to more conservative states have reported being mocked, questioned, or even warned not to vote the wrong way. This might sound exaggerated, but it really happens. What's important here is not whether or not this behavior is reasonable. It's about what it reveals. Politics in the US is no longer just about policy preferences. It's about social belonging. When politics becomes your identity, disagreement stops feeling like disagreement. So when someone hears a criticism of their preferred candidate, they don't process it as information. They process it as an attack on their community, their way of life, and their right to exist as who they are. One of the strongest and most consistent divides in US politics is education level. Voters without a four-year college degree lean heavily toward Trump, while voters with college degrees, especially postgraduate education, tend to vote more Democrat. This gap has widened in every election since 2016. And it's important to say this clearly up front. This isn't just about a difference in intelligence. It's about who politics feels like it's designed for. In the US, education has quietly become a cultural gatekeeper, not just for jobs, but for perceived legitimacy. It shapes whose language is considered serious, whose opinions sound credible, who gets invited into policy conversations, and who is treated as informational versus emotional. Over time, American politics have adopted the language of universities, nonprofits, and educational institutions. If you didn't go to college, or if you entered the workforce early, this language can feel alienating, not just because people don't understand, but because politics is discussed in a way that doesn't sound like how they talk. When someone hears phrases like structural inequities, intersectional impacts, and evidence-based policy frameworks, they hear people talking about them and not with them. And this is where Trump is extremely effective. He doesn't speak like a professor. He doesn't speak like a policy analyst. He does not speak like a politician trained in institutional language. He uses short sentences, simple vocabulary, repetition, emotion, and certainty. He says things like, "They're lying to you. They don't respect you. They think they're better than you." There's no jargon, no qualifiers, and no footnotes. For many of his supporters, this language doesn't feel unsophisticated or unprofessional. To them, it feels accessible. It feels like someone finally speaking in a way that doesn't require credentials to understand. This is also why Trump's attacks on experts resonates so much with his fan base. When Trump mocks scientists, journalists, professors, or the elites, his supporters don't hear a rejection of knowledge. They hear rejection of a system that has long made them feel talked down to, dismissed, or judged. So when experts try to fact-check Trump, it often backfires. because to them, these corrections, even if they're factually accurate, don't sound like neutral information. It's heard as the same voices saying to them, "You don't understand this, you shouldn't be deciding," or "People like you always get this wrong." Defending Trump, then, to them becomes symbolic, because it's not about defending every statement he makes, but it's now become about defending themselves, their intelligence, their lived experience, and their right to have a say. And once politics becomes about protecting your dignity, the kind of messaging that resonates changes. There's a pattern that shows up again and again in modern American conservatism that's hard to see from the outside. Most of them don't have a plan for what they think a future under conservatives should look like, because they're not really pro anything. They're just anti-everything. They're organized around opposition to social change, opposition to cultural shifts, opposition to institutions that challenge existing hierarchies. That's why the messaging is so effective when it focuses on what must be stopped and not what must be built. When politics is framed this way, it doesn't need a coherent plan. It just needs a target. Any honest explanation of Trump's support and how we got to where we are has to include the topic of race, because racial anxiety is one of the strongest emotional currents his messaging taps into. And this isn't incidental. It's structural. The United States was built on racial hierarchy. From its founding, race determined who could own land, who could vote, who could accumulate wealth, and who could be protected by the law. Enslavement, indigenous displacement, segregation, redlining, exclusion from education and housing. These weren't side effects of American history. They were foundational systems. For most of the country's history, whiteness functioned as an unspoken default, not something that you had to defend or explain, just something that shaped who belonged, who had authority, and who was assumed to be normal. That doesn't mean all white Americans lived comfortably or prospered, but it did mean that race quietly structured who started closer to the center of society. Over the last decade, that default has eroded. The US has become more racially diverse, more multilingual, more open about historical injustice, more explicit about inequality. And for many people, especially white Americans without college degrees, that shift doesn't feel like progress. For them, this feels like displacement. Not always economical displacement, but social and psychological displacement. Suddenly, conversations about race, privilege, and history felt accusatory. Language changed, institutions started acknowledging harm, and the idea that America was purely merit-based was openly challenged. For people who grew up believing that they were just normal Americans, that felt like being told that their identity was now a problem. And Trump is especially effective at exploiting that feeling. He almost never talks about race directly. He doesn't need to. Instead, he uses coded language that has a long history in American politics. He talks about borders instead of race, crime instead of inequality, law and order instead of policing, and culture instead of history. These substitutions are not accidental. These allow people to engage with racial fear without having to name it or to confront it morally. And you can see this logic playing out right now. When ICE raids, detentions, or shootings make the news, a majority of those Americans don't see this as radicalized state violence. They interpret this as enforcement, as order being restored, as a system finally doing what it's supposed to do. Even when those actions clearly harm innocent people or escalate far beyond necessity, the framing still works because it activates fear before empathy. If immigration is framed as an invasion, then using force feels justified. A majority of Trump voters will probably never outwardly say, "I'm worried about losing racial dominance." They'll say, "I'm worried about crime. I'm worried about the border," or "I'm just trying to preserve our culture." That ambiguity makes the message powerful. It allows different people to hear what they want to hear and deny racist intent, even while supporting clearly racially exclusionary outcomes. And to be very clear, for some voters, racism is not subconscious or ambiguous at all. They understand exactly who Trump is talking about. They recognize the targets, they support the hierarchy being defended, and they agree with him because of it. But there's another layer that explains why this messaging works beyond just the overt racism. For many people, this radicalized rhetoric offers them something emotionally comforting, someone else to blame. When life feels harder than it's supposed to be, when wages stagnate, status erodes, and the future feels uncertain, having a clear external villain is easier than confronting a system that feels abstract and complicated. So immigrants become the explanation. Blame turns uncertainty into a story with cause and direction. And that story protects people from a more painful truth, that the world changed in ways that they can't control, that the promises that they were raised with may never be fulfilled, and that no leader is actually coming to restore the life that they expected. Instead of pointing that frustration upward toward concentrated wealth, corporate power, and political institutions that no longer serve us, Trump redirects it sideways. He turns structural failure into an us versus them fight. where the anger never reaches the systems that actually caused the damage. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest reasons why Trump received as many votes as he did, because America has never fully reckoned with just how deeply race has structured belonging, power, and dignity. That's why his rhetoric continues to work, because it's built on a foundation that the country has never fully dismantled. So, here's the uncomfortable truth. Yes, millions of Americans are voting against their own material self-interest. Some don't even realize it, but most do, and they're willing to accept it anyway. And it's very important that I say this clearly. Most Americans are not uneducated or unaware. Millions of Americans did not want this. Many Americans are angry, are grieving what they feel is being lost, and are exhausted from trying to explain that this is not who we want to be. But until people stop voting out of fear, resentment, and zero-sum thinking, this tension isn't going away.